How enslaved people shaped the development of America. Directly or indirectly, the economies of all 13 British colonies in North America depended on slavery. It was the work of enslaved people that helped to build the American economy. Among the first documented Africans in British North America were approximately 20 men and women who arrived at Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. They were captives, likely from the kingdom of Ngungo in present-day Angola. Privateers had seized them from a slave ship bound for Mexico and traded them in Virginia. The Africans worked the tobacco fields in Jamestown alongside white indentured servants. Question 1. The first black Africans brought to America in 1619 were used for what work? By the 1620s, the labor-intensive farming of tobacco for European markets was established in Virginia, with white indentured servants performing most of the heavy labor. Before 1660, only a fraction of Virginia planters held slaves. By 1675, slavery was well established, and by 1700, slaves had almost entirely replaced indentured servants. With plentiful land and slave labor available to grow a lucrative crop, Southern planters prospered, and family-based tobacco plantations became the economic and social norm. By the 1800s, a new crop, cotton, would replace the economic power of tobacco. Question 2. By the 1700s, black African slave labor had replaced what earlier colonial workforce? Examine carefully this reproduction of a handbill advertising a slave auction in Charleston, South Carolina in 1769. Question 3. What terms are used to describe the enslaved people? By 1700, there were 27,817 enslaved Africans in British North America. In 1740, there were 150,024. By 1770, the number of slaves had grown to 462,000, about 1/5 of the total colonial population. Question 4. What does this line graph tell us about the population of enslaved people in America from 1790 to 1880? Click on this link. Question 5. Prior to 1850, were there enslaved people living in the northern colonies above Maryland? Question 6. Describe how the map changes from 1790 to 1860. Whereas some doubts have arisen whether children produced by an Englishman and a Negro woman should be slave or free, be it therefore enacted and declared by this present Grand Assembly that all children born in this country shall be held bond or free only according to the condition of the mother. This law was passed by the Virginia legislature in 1662. It made all children born of an enslaved mother the property of her master and born enslaved. Question 7. Why do you think Virginian plantation and slave owners would have wanted this law to be passed? Question 8. How does this law represent the views of many slave owners and the government about the legal rights of enslaved people? The Stono Rebellion. Enslaved people everywhere resisted their exploitation and attempted to gain freedom. They fully understood that rebellions would bring about massive retaliation from white people and therefore had little chance of success. Even so, rebellions occurred frequently. One notable uprising that became known as the Stono Rebellion took place in South Carolina in September 1739. A literate enslaved man named Jemmy led a large group of enslaved people in an armed insurrection against white colonists, killing several before militia stopped them. The militia suppressed the rebellion after a battle in which both enslaved people and militiamen were killed. The remaining enslaved people were executed or sold to the West Indies. In the wake of the Stono Rebellion, South Carolina passed a new slave code in 1740 called an Act for the Better Ordering and Governing of Negroes and Other Slaves in the Province, also known as the Negro Act of 1740. This law imposed new limits on enslaved people's behavior, prohibiting them from assembling, growing their own food, learning to write, and traveling freely. Question 9. Why is the Stono Rebellion an important part of the history of colonial America? Question 10. As a result of slave rebellions, states imposed slave codes. What was the purpose of these laws? Slaves in the urban North. Slavery grew quickly in the South because of the region's large plantations. However, slavery in New England was different. New England did not have large plantations for growing crops. Here it was more common to have one or two enslaved people working for a household, business, or small farm. Enslaved people often learned special skills and crafts. Lacking large-scale plantations, New England did not have the same level of demand for slave labor as the South, but slavery still existed there until well into the 19th century. The overall percentage of slaves in New England was only 2 to 3%, but in cities such as Boston and Newport, 20 to 25% of the population consisted of enslaved laborers. Ships in Boston seaport sailed enslaved Africans along the Atlantic and throughout the Caribbean. Question 11. What impact did slavery have on the New England colonies? Although the largest percentage of slaves were found in the South, slavery did exist in the middle colonies as well, despite the strong Quaker influence. Large cities such as Philadelphia and New York also supported significant enslaved populations. Although enslaved people in cities and towns were not needed as agricultural workers, they were employed in a variety of other capacities: domestic service, artisan, craftsmen, sailors, dock workers, laundresses, and coachmen. In 1711, New York was growing quickly, and the growing needs of the city were often supplied by slave labor. Nearly 1,000 out of the 6,400 New Yorkers were black, and at least 40% of the white households included a slave. The slave market in New York City, located where Wall Street reached the East River, was established in 1711 as a place where enslaved blacks and Native Americans could be hired or purchased. Question 12. Oftentimes in history, slavery is viewed as something that only happened in the South on large plantations, but slavery existed throughout colonial America. Why do you think that many people in the North do not admit the role of slavery in the middle and northern colonies? Question 13. What correlation or relationship does this bar graph demonstrate about the growth of slavery and cotton in America from 1790 to 1860? By 1750, there were over 235,000 enslaved Africans in America. About 85% lived in the southern colonies. Enslaved Africans made up about 40% of the South's population. The growth of slavery allowed plantation farming to expand in South Carolina and Georgia. Growth of cotton, indigo, rice, and tobacco contributed to the wealth and prosperity of America. More than half of the nation's exports from 1800 to 1860 consisted of raw cotton, almost all of it grown by enslaved people. The slave economy of the southern states had ripple effects throughout the entire U.S. economy, with plenty of merchants in New York City, Boston, and elsewhere helping to organize the trade of slave-grown agricultural products and enjoying plenty of riches as a result. Massive profits from cotton allowed the U.S. to invest in transportation and other industries. Over the history of America, nearly 4 million Americans were enslaved. Even after the 13th Amendment ended slavery, former enslaved people received no compensation for their centuries of free labor. Question 14. About what percentage of the South's total population was enslaved people by 1750? Question 15. Which of the plantation crops grown by enslaved people had the largest economic impact on the growth of America? Edward Baptist argues in his book, The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of an American Capitalism, that the forced migration and subsequent harsh treatment of slaves in the cotton fields was integral to establishing the United States as a world economic power. From 1783, at the end of the American Revolution, to 1861, the number of slaves in America increased 5 times over, and all this expansion produced a powerful nation. For white enslavers were able to force enslaved African American migrants to pick cotton faster and more efficiently than free people. Their practices rapidly transformed the southern states into the dominant force in the global cotton market, and cotton was the world's most widely traded commodity at that time, as it was the key raw material during the first century of the Industrial Revolution. Slavery was evil. Slavery was racist. Slavery limited the development of African nations in order to promote the development of Europe and America. Slavery helped to build America, but also was extremely destructive to the lives of enslaved people and the generations that followed them. Question 16. What do you think is the most important learning you can take away from this passage?